In this lecture, we are going to talk about the NIST privacy framework. We will provide a quick review in case you had taken a break between the previous lecture and this one. We will define what risk-based means. We will talk about the NIST framework approach, the three parts to the NIST privacy framework, and then we will conclude by defining maturity. As a quick refresher, NIST stands for the National Institute of Standards and Technology. It is a sub-agency within the United States Department of Commerce. The privacy framework provided by NIST is a voluntary framework, and it is designed to be technology, sector, and law agnostic. Before we talk about the privacy framework approach, I want to first define what risk-based means. And that's because this framework takes a risk-based approach. So risk-based means that there is a prioritization of identification, assessment, and mitigation of risks based on potential impact. These approaches, risk-based approaches, focus on threats and vulnerabilities that could affect organizations' assets and operations. And so just to be clear here and to provide a quick example, when we're looking at prioritizing risks based on potential impact, we are looking at what the possible outcome of a risk could be. Let's say that we have two systems and both of these systems contain personal data. System number 1 has name and phone number. System number 2 has name, medical records, and financial information. Well, I think we would all agree that system number 2 has more sensitive data, and that if we could only protect one of these systems, we would choose to protect number 1. And again, that's because the impact of a breach of that system, of potentially losing medical records and financial information, would be greater than a breach of a system where the data was just name and phone number. And so we prioritize based on the impact of the worst case scenario, in this case, a leak or loss of that data. And so, as I mentioned, the NIST framework approach is a risk-based approach. The intent is to consider privacy throughout the product lifecycle, which is consistent with what we've seen throughout the course so far. The approach seeks to communicate privacy practices. Again, how can we operationalize privacy? And encourage cross-functional collaboration. And again, this is collaboration throughout all of the different functions and offices throughout an organization. IT, cybersecurity, privacy, marketing, finance, legal, etc. There are three parts to the NIST privacy framework. They are core, profile, and tier. The core consists of privacy protection activities. Profiles consist of activities customized to the organization based on risk appetite, goals, and resources. And the tiers respond to the levels of operational maturity. Now, if that doesn't make any sense to you, hey, welcome to the club. The number one critique of the NIST privacy framework is that it's difficult to understand. The good news is this is all you need to know for the CIPM exam. And even better news, NIST is in the process of rebooting the privacy framework. There is a 2.0 that is in the works, and I'm hoping, with fingers and toes crossed, that I'll be able to understand what the next framework is all about. One final note here, just in case you see it on the exam, the CIPM body of knowledge is mapped to the NIST privacy framework. I want to conclude this lecture by briefly defining what maturity is, and I want to do it within the context of a maturity model. Specifically, I want to talk about the MITRE maturity model. Real quick, MITRE is a not-for-profit, federally funded research and development organization that advises the U.S. federal government, and it has created a maturity model for privacy, for AI. It likely has one for cybersecurity and a number of other IT-related disciplines. For privacy, the 5 different maturity levels are as follows. Initial is level 1, repeatable is level 2, defined is 3, managed is 4, and optimized is 5. A privacy program that is at level 1 is just getting off the ground. It is taking its initial steps in establishing itself, writing its policies, its processes, its procedures, communicating with stakeholders, etc. An organization that is at level 2 means that there are policies and processes, perhaps some procedures that are in place and that are repeatable. But at level 2, those policies and procedures may not be written down. At level 3, all of those policies, procedures are written down. They're well defined, perhaps in standard operating procedures. The team is established and they understand their responsibilities, and so forth and so on. The main takeaway here with the maturity model is that organizations are able to self-assess and place their organization or different functions throughout their organization at these different levels, and then use this self-assessment to improve. In this lecture, we went over the NIST privacy framework. Remember that this is a voluntary framework that is technology, sector, and law agnostic. Remember that a risk-based approach prioritizes the identification, assessment, and mitigation of risk based on potential impact. The greater potential impact, the more resources we want to devote to that particular risk. The NIST framework approach is risk-based. The objective is to consider privacy throughout the product lifecycle, to communicate privacy practices, and to encourage cross-functional collaboration. And for the exam, you should definitely remember the core, profile, and tier, and likely a brief summary of what each of those parts is. Finally, when you think about maturity model and MITREs in particular. And remember the 5 levels of maturity: initial, repeatable, defined, managed, and optimized.